Hi, my name is Allie, and I am going to be talking about Israel Keys for my final criminal psych criminal profile paper. I decided to do Israel Keys for this paper because he's a notorious serial killer that is not talked about very often, but his crime and his level of organization is extremely high for a serial killer, and some of the traits that he represented are just very diagnosable and set him apart from a lot of other killers. And again, he's not talked about frequently. His case is very interesting. So that's why I decided to choose him. So, Israel Keys, he grew up in a rural area in Washington. He was born in Utah, but his family, when he was very young, moved to a rural area of Washington. It was so rural, in fact, he did not have running water, he didn't have electricity, and there was no access to, like, society, so he had no idea, like, what societal norms, like, mainstream kind of media type stuff was. He grew up with very authoritarian parents, and they were fundamentalist. And the only social interaction he was able to have was with his siblings. He grew up in a large family, so he had a lot of siblings, and then his like neighbors and like townsfolk kind of people. This isolation and rigid upbringing had a major effect on his behavior, especially his criminal behavior later on. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes. He had some early behavioral issues that definitely would have been diagnosable for conduct disorder. He, if he was treated, which he was not, but if he was in a proper like school system or just doctor, like seeing a doctor frequently, he probably would have been diagnosed with conduct disorder. He, some of the traits he exhibited were animal cruelty, fascinations with weapons and fire, and those are like the predominant ones, which are all, conduct disorder traits. And this foundational base of his antisocial behavior is what led to his diagnosis later on. He was never formally diagnosed, but like professionals say that that's what he for sure had. So let's talk about biological factors now. He presented severe signs of emotional detachment. He did not have any lack of remorse. He had a superficial charm like most serial killers do. Ted Bundy, Gacy, Ed Gein, they all have this superficial ego. Rodney Alcala, that's probably one of the most prominent killers with a superficial charm. This killer, Israel Keys, also had that. And these traits, this emotional detachment, lack of remorse, and superficial charm, align with psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. I found some neurological research that shows that reduced activation in the amygdala and ventromedial prefrontal cortex areas, it shows that people with these traits have reduced activity in these areas, and these areas are very critical for functioning as a human in general. These areas are critical for empathy growth, just empathy usage in general, and moral reasoning, which are two very key traits that humans need to function effectively. Another source that I use is from a book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, which is an amazing book that I've read for a different class, but was applicable for this course as well. And the entire book talks about different childhood trauma and how that affected these children later on, and this psychiatrist who deals with kids with extreme trauma. And one of the things that I pulled from that book for this paper was the fact that early emotional deprivation can hinder neural networks, that are responsible for stress regulation and empathy. And that just means that early emotional deprivation in the early stages of life, especially the younger years, the first years of life, can actually cause these neural networks that your brain needs to be able to function properly, and for stress regulation and empathy building and relational, like functional, like to be functional as a human being, like relationally. They won't grow, they won't function. They'll become underdeveloped or not developed at all, which is very interesting. Now let's talk about his criminal history. So Israel Keyes began killing. He had quite a span, a little more, a little bit of a long stretch. He began killing in the late 1990s and continued until 2012. And one of the most prominent things about his span of crime is that it was not specific to one location or population. He did not have a preference for person, and in fact, his strategic thought was to spread out his killings in so many different states and areas of the country, and possibly abroad, we're not sure, but possibly abroad, as he was also in the military and was accused of some stat rape and assaults in the military as well. But another super interesting tidbit about his crimes is that he buried kill kits in different states. So he would travel throughout the country, pick somewhere that he was interested in, and then bury a 2-gallon bucket full of different supplies that he would need to carry out a murder. These kill kits, he would bury them years in advance, months or years in advance, and they would hold a firearm or two, usually a silencer, ropes, and some other tools. These crimes were methodical and instrumental. They were not impulsive. He was not an impulsive person. It was not out of emotion. It was more of the delayed gratification and stuff. He carefully selected his victims and actually did like reconnaissance and stalked them until he was ready to commit the act. But he again had a broad variety of victims, including couples. He was not specific on the victim, as he was so invested in not getting caught. Okay, now we're going to talk about psychological and situational factors. Keyes' instrumental violence was reinforced through operant learning, antisocial behavior rewarded internally or externally. And all that means is that his antisocial behavior rewarded internally. It gave him a sense of gratification to act in certain ways, like, acting out cruelty, violence as a child, or externally, the lack of consequences for his behaviors. Situational opportunities, he traveled extensively for work, but also just because, again, to get that sense of anonymity. And he was also able to scout out the right type of victim, the victims that are, not protected. He, again, did pre-planning, surveillance, and then, planted those kill kits, and that showed a strategic way of thinking and delayed gratification, which are both hallmarks of organized offenders. So, forensic psychology contributions. The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit helped profile Keyes. They used organized serial offender frameworks, behavioral analysis, victimology, geographic profiling, posthumous risk assessment, helped reconstruct his crimes and assess them. Investigators also use rapport building, which has been taught to me repetitively that is one of the most important therapeutic skills to master. And the investigators use that in this case as serial killers and just offenders in general that have antisocial personality disorder, and a lot of these traits that he was exhibiting have this higher inflated sense of ego and this sense of control. They need this desire for control for the conversation, and so they used rapport to lower his inhibitions and to decrease resistance. Legal implications. So Keyes He obviously was not unfit to stand trial. He was not uh, incapable of standing trial. He was competent, and his traits of psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder did not qualify him for the insanity defense. And treatment options for people with this type of behavior are not entirely successful. They're not very successful, and so that was not really an option either. So, in total, in conclusion, Israel Keyes, his crimes were the result of different factors, including developmental, biological, psychological, and situational factors, isolation, early conduct issues, and those rigid ideologies, the authoritarian parenting. All of these factors produced what he ended up being. And this case just shows a complex combination of factors that created this type of offender.